So Verena is so upset that I found this later when I finally got the death certificate. I finally managed to find it. Nobody had seen it for forever, probably since she died. And Kate Pulitzer is the one that signs the death register. Her mother was too upset, couldn't do it. So Kate, Winnie's best friend, signs the death register. So, a very sad end. She and the whole family are now buried in Richmond at Hollywood Cemetery. Have any of you been to Hollywood? Awesome. If you haven't, it's amazing. And they have an air-conditioned trolley, by the way, you can rent to take you all around the cemetery. Well worth it. And not expensive, so I highly recommend that. So President's Circle is where Winnie and all the Davises are buried. And I went and visited her a lot when I was writing this book. Even when I was in Iowa, I'd just come back and sit there because it just, to get that melancholy kind of feeling, that's the place to go. Now I'm not going to end on that horrible note. One more thing about Winnie, and I'll tell you very briefly about my next book, and then we'll stop and have questions. I know it gets long. I like to remember Winnie as more of a Gibson girl. She was really, you know, the true woman, tried to forced into that role of being submissive, pious, you know, pure, kind of like her mother, this old 18th century role for so long. But towards the end of her life, she was really becoming what historians later would call the new woman, the Gibson girl. She was biking, she had a bike, she loved to whiz around New York and Narragansett on her bike. She was starting to wear clothes like this. She was an author, she was celebrated. She was really going places, and she was just right on the cusp of sort of women becoming suffragettes, becoming a bit more emancipated. Now, she said she did not support women voting, but I'm not really sure she really felt that way. She was still kind of under her parents' thumb. But I like to think of her that way, and I think that's when she was her happiest, is when she was biking around Narragansett and writing her books. So that's all about Winnie, and I do have just a few books over here if anyone is interested. You can also buy it off Amazon, Barnes & Noble, any of that. My next book, which I'll talk just very briefly about, and there's actually a friend of mine, Marion Novak, in the audience, who's written an incredible book on sort of a similar subject about military wives in Vietnam herself and how she coped with that. Very inspiring to me. I'm writing a book, which is well underway, about women who were POW, prisoner of war, and missing in action wives during Vietnam. One of the star women in my book, Phyllis Galante, is from Roanoke, and she's one of my major wives, and when the book comes out, I'll certainly want to do stuff here about Phyllis. She's amazing. She died very recently, unfortunately. But these women all came together to get their husbands out of what many of you have heard of, the Hanoi Hilton, where John McCain and others were imprisoned. These women were all officers' wives. When their husbands were shot down or missing in action, they were told to keep quiet. That was the policy under LBJ, just shut up, be quiet, don't tell anyone, including your friends and family, except for close family. You weren't allowed to tell anyone. And these women, after a while, say, this is ridiculous, this is not going to work. And they get Nixon and Kissinger on board, and they go public, they start telling their stories, and they form the National League for POW MIA in Southeast Asia, and they go and they pretty much are the men's rescuers. I like to think of them as the SEAL team and Mickey Moto girls. And they go in and they just get out there and they tell the government what to do. They have a hotline to Kissinger, and they start telling the government folks what to do, and they actually listen. It's amazing. I mean, I just get so excited talking about it because nobody has written a book about it. So these women are finally going to get their place in history, I hope. So stay tuned. That book will be out in 2017. Hopefully it's actually going up for sale next week. We've had a lot of interest. My agent has, so I hope we're going to sell it quickly. But regardless, it will be out soon, and love to come talk to you about that when that comes out as well. Thank you for being so patient. Thank you for the technology help. Thank you so much. You were a rock star. Thank you. Yes, questions?
What became of Fred?
Oh, poor Fred. I always forget about poor Fred because I'm always thinking about the women all the time. So the men are sort of, you know, peripheral. But No offense, Ken, but Fred has a nervous breakdown. He is in Atlantic City and then has a heart attack. Now this is much later. He never marries. He pines for Winnie. There's a story that they meet at the Pulitzers at a party, which I'm pretty sure is true. I've documented that a couple of ways. And don't speak to each other, pass each other, don't speak. I think Fred hides behind a potted palm, that kind of thing. And then they neither ever marries. Of course, she dies, and then he dies. I believe he's 54, and he has a heart attack and has these nervous problems. And I have to believe this experience just traumatized him. Though he goes on to be a very successful lawyer, but he never was interested in anybody else. So. Yes.
This is a Hollywood movie, Fred and Winnie.
Oh my goodness. Well, I will tell you, I had, if anybody has seen, let me think, recent movies, Ricky and the Flash is one, this is a Mark Platt Productions movie, and Mark Platt's guys called me. They got the book before it was even out. They got an advanced copy, and they really wanted to do something with it. But I have to tell you, I mean, my theory, when all these horrible things happen, like the Charleston shooting, and then the Confederate Monuments dispute, etc., I just think the climate we're in right now is now not very receptive to that, which really saddens me, because it's the real Gone with the Wind. I mean, I think it'll come around. I mean, I just think, the timing was a little off, but something's going to happen. It's too good of a story, I think, not to be. I agree, I think it would be. It's so cinematic, it would be a great movie. So it'll come around. Other questions? Yes, sir. Oh, in the title of the new book, which I think I might have, yes, it's The Reluctant Sorority. And I think the subtitle is going to be something like Pearls to Politics, Vietnam War Wives. We're working on the subtitle now, but The Reluctant Sorority is the main title, and that is because the West Coast wives I interviewed, one of the West Coast wives that was very prominent in this movement said, we were, the POW and MIA wives, the reluctant sorority, the sorority no one wanted to belong to. And I thought, ugh. So I had like 5 titles, and I had the ladies that are involved vote on it, and they all unanimously picked that. So hopefully that title will be a good one. It really summed it up. Nobody wanted to be in that, but these women became like sisters for life. These women were more important to each other than blood family by the end of this conflict. So, other questions? Yes.
There was a young colored boy showed up at Jefferson Davis's family, and
Yep.
I'm not sure where he came from. He got a kind of a question with him.
Yes.
But Jefferson Davis adopted him.
That's right. That's exactly
And he stayed
right.
with him.
He did.
He all of a sudden vanished too, so.
Yes, and I can tell you a little bit about this young black boy that well, he would have been black at that time. We wouldn't have been using the term African American. Young black boy. The Davis family did adopt this young boy, and they were very close with this boy. He was actually being beaten in the street. And I know I remember this correctly. Verena rescued him. She saw him, Joseph Limper was his name. She saw him being beaten in the street, and she rescued him and brought him home to basically be a playmate for the Davis children. And they were all very fond of him and adopted him. However, when the war ended, and of course Davis was sent to Fort Monroe, and Verena and the children were whisked off. When Davis was going to Fort Monroe, they had Limper with them, this young boy. And this is where the record gets strange, or just it disappears. He was given to a Confederate officer for this officer to take care of him, and then he just disappears from the pages of history, which is so true of, of minorities and women. They just disappeared. There's no documentation. But that is true, and I think a lot of people don't realize that about Davis, nor do they realize that he was a very, I know progressive and slave owner in the same sentence sounds terrible, but he taught all his slaves to read and write. He was often really scorned by other slave owners because they thought he was too good to his slaves. So slavery is horrible, but as slave owners went, he was considered very progressive in his time.
Jim Limper.
I'm sorry, Jim, you're right. Jim Limper, not Jim. Jim, you're correct. But yeah, I don't think most people, that's great you know that, because most people don't know that.
more of a comment. I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia.
Yes.
And my best friend's name was Marcia Lee Buck. And later, her email address is Lee something. And I said, where does the Lee come from? She says, you don't know? That's Robert E. Lee.
Oh my
She
gosh.
said, everyone in my family has the name Lee in it.
Wow, that is very cool. Oh yes, he's still, I think, so revered in so many places, and definitely in Atlanta, I think so. Yes, home of Margaret Mitchell too.
Right.
Who doesn't have Atlanta? Come on, what a great story. Anyone else? Other questions? Anything else?
Not to be too personal, but your name itself is like you explain your.
Certainly, yes. Well, when I worked for Stratford Hall, the director, who was a good friend of mine, he's like, "Hey, just tell people that you're Robert E. Lee's great-granddaughter or something." And I was like, "I'm not. I mean, they're, my husband's family lies and says they're related. They're totally not. They're making it up. You're from Iowa." I'm like, "No, that's not happening." So, now the Heath is my mother's maiden name. So, and I certainly had relatives who, fought for the Confederacy, and one of my I think it was my great-great-grandmother was a UDC president. So I mean, there's a long connection there, with the story. But I really wasn't interested in any of that. It was just seeing that portrait. I didn't know anything. I didn't care. Nobody cares about their family history when they're young, really. But I saw that picture and thought, I've got to know who that is. She looks like a princess, and I like her outfit, and I want to know what the story is. Very superficial, but it got me into a lot of research. Anything else? Yes?
This is a silly little thing, but I was really intrigued by the Alcott, Louisa May Alcott thing. And I kept thinking of Laurie, remember the neighbor boy?
Yes.
Yes. Excuse me, we were describing Alfred or Fred Wilkinson.
Very similar, yes. Isn't that, and the Alcott connection is amazing in there. Most people don't know that. Samuel May, this abolitionist grandfather, was part of the Alcott family.
It's in your book.
Yes, it's in the book, and you can read, there was a connection, and then Fred's father, I remember Louisa May Alcott, consoling Fred's mother. When Fred's father, who was this horrible alcoholic, died, she wrote in her diary, Alfred Sr. dead, relief to all, or something. It was hilarious. She just hated him. He had ruined the family. So it's funny, and that's one of the great things about writing about history is all these famous people make cameos. Buffalo Bill shows up. Louisa May Alcott shows up. Oscar Wilde, one of my favorite characters ever in history, shows up. So you just never know who you're going to run across, and that's what made the book so enjoyable, was having all these interesting people sort of make cameo appearances in Winnie's life. Anything else? Yes, ma'am.
The Vietnam wives, did you ever read
Yes.
the Kate Holmes?
I haven't, no.
Her husband, I never met her, but her husband was a classmate.
Really? And a POW? And did he come
He is
back?
an MIA.
Oh, MIA.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's one of the goals of the book, is to talk about the MIAs too. People forget, the people missing action that never came back.
What I,
Sad.
it was hard to use later that I guess she never remarried.
Well, in so many cases, I think it did just, the trauma was just a lot for people to handle. There are many women I talked to that never wanted to remarry. And many that did. It was interesting, just depended on the personality. But yes, I'll be talking about that in the book. Anything else? These are great questions, and you're such a great audience. Thank you. Thanks for bearing with me.